And we are, thank God, a very resilient people. And Americans tend to be very optimistic people. And we will come out of it. But it will take from the second quarter. So we just have to hang in, preserve what we can, make cuts where we can, and find revenues. And there are revenues. Yes, the various reserve funds and all this, and try and convince the governor that the cuts don't have to be the first thing, that it can be done in conjunction with it. So that's the mess we're in. I turn the mess over to
You know, it did strike me that Suzi and I spent a lot of money and time wanting to be in this. I remember I was campaigning in front of, I think, Stop and Shop, and I was on the way going one way, Suzi was coming the other way. I just had that little voice in the back of my head saying, "You're really sure you want to do this?" We are really sure we want to do this. Since I guess you haven't been fed yet, can you handle this on an empty stomach? I have a breakdown of what the governor has proposed in cuts. And I'm going to circulate it around. I hope I have enough copies for everybody. If you can kind of jumpstart those to the back tables. And generally, the rule of thumb is, how does it affect me and what I care about? You know? I mean, that's pretty much the bottom line. Why don't we take some of those over there? Forgive me for any redundancy, because I'm sure Suzi has said what I'm about to say. But just in terms of where we are at this minute, I guess both of us, before the end of the day, are going to be heading to Albany. Tomorrow there is a session at 12 noon in which we are to consider the governor's proposed cuts. That's what you're seeing if you get a copy of this document. And it is broken down, I presume, into different legislative bills. That's the inside baseball. But it's not one massive up or down vote. But what we don't know is whether or not we will be voting on some, any, or all of these cuts. There are 5 players in the game. You know this before, you've read it before. You heard about 3 men in a room. It's not that simple. There's 5 groups of interests, and that would be the majority and minorities in both houses, and the governor as representative of the executive branch. So what you've seen is the proposal, which you've heard about, is the proposal from the governor and the executive branch. What you haven't seen is how do the respective majority and minorities in each house look at these different issues. And that's important, because if you read the editorial yesterday in the Journal News, they talk about the legislature as if it's a monolithic institution, and it's not. It's not. It's composed of 2 houses and 2 separate majorities in each. Now, the minorities in each house, under normal circumstances, don't have a lot of power. However, I'm sure Suzi said this, we're on the verge of seeing the majority change in the Senate. So the Senate minority for today may be the Senate majority of tomorrow, so their opinions matter a lot in the way this plays out and in the negotiations that happen. I've noticed there have been comments about why haven't the legislative leaders offered their own cuts. For any of you who have ever served on any board of any institution, any board, Irene is head of the Friends of the Marshlands, Lynn chairs an organization, Carolyn is a member of the library board. You as one individual don't speak unilaterally for all your members. What do you usually do? You consult with the other members of your board before you make a statement. Even Sergeant Lynn can't make policy on his own. He goes back, he has certain things he works off of. So when you're asking how come I haven't heard so-and-so elected officials say what the Assembly, the Senate's going to do, is because what's going to happen today is going to be consultation with senators in both majority and minority conferences, and the same in the Assembly. Now, when the Assembly conference, majority conference get together, there's 106 of us, 106 members in the Assembly Democratic majority. And I might add, and this is more pejorative than proud, we're Democrats, meaning we are going to argue amongst ourselves to beat the band. There's 106 of us, there's probably 212 opinions in that room when we sit and meet. So if someone is saying, how come it isn't that they haven't come out and already issued their cuts, it's because A, we haven't discussed it in one room yet together, and B, there are lots of different points of view. Let me just ask you, Emmy Lou, if you were the Assemblywoman for a poor section of the Bronx, would you view these cuts the same way that Dr. Romney would view them, Dr. Romney, if you were the Assembly member for the Upper East Side? Just think about that and multiply it out by all the districts that you have. So there is a debate yet to be had. Hopefully, you've had a chance to see the bullets that have come across. Suzi and I are getting flooded by emails from various interests that are saying, don't cut this and don't cut that. Now, the word special, the phrase special interest has a negative connotation. It speaks of people who are fighting for their economic interest and they're fat cats, they're going to take us out to dinner and all that type of stuff. Let me tell you some of the emails we're getting. And it's obvious that I've been out to dinner, but on my own dime. Let me point that that's going to change, of course, this year. Certainly, we've talked a lot about the school education. That's the big nut in all of this. But that Medicaid is a comparable size nut. And we've been getting communications from people involved in Sarah Newman Nursing Home, Schumacher in White Plains, and I'm even getting it. It's not my district. But from the various hospitals and nursing people who are on those boards, they're emailing us to say don't make these cuts. So when you hear the story about special interest, what you have to factor in is every one of these lines that we're pointing to involves some element of public interest by some group of individuals. And the concept special interest is to make it seem as if what they want is not necessarily what the general population wants. You tell me, is it a good idea to underfund Washingtonville Housing Alliance? Is it a good idea to underfund Sarah Newman? Is it a good idea to underfund the arts? That's what we're going to be discussing in our respective conferences today. We're going to be bringing it down, not just to the numbers, which we know are significant, but what is the human effect of cutting this number versus that number? And if so, by how much? The governor has estimated that in this proposal that we need to cut $2 billion. That's obviously, this is hundreds of thousands. $2 billion from this budget. The estimates of how much the gap has ranged somewhere in the vicinity of 1.5, maybe a little higher. We don't know exactly. He's argued that we need to cut $2 billion in order to give us a buffer to get us through the rest of the year. That's a debatable topic. And the discussable topic as to how far these cuts would have to go. And then the final just generic point I want to make on all of this is that you do have a political reality. I guess Suzi's touched on this because it's in her house. But the Republican majority that will be losing their majority status has sent signals that has said they may not want to take any action this week because by the time we have to deal with it in the new year, the Democrats will be in charge of everything. Let them make the tough decisions. Now, I'm not trying to be negative partisan that you've read that line in the newspaper, if you follow what Dean Skelos has said. So we may get up there and we may find that the Senate majority Republicans don't want to engage in a dialogue where the rest of the players might say, okay, we don't want to cut the schools at $585. We certainly would be okay with a bottle bill. Can we handle, this particular cut, but not that one? What are the chances of this happening? And come up with some package that could equate to some smaller number, 500 million, 800 million, without having the whole McGill. If the Senate majority Republicans decide that, you won the election, good luck to you, it's your problem, and we leave town, then tomorrow in the newspaper you're going to see state legislature does nothing. Okay? And the slime is going to be on any of us. And when you see me on Wednesday or Thursday, whenever we're back in town, you see Suzi, someone's going to wag their finger and say, George Latimer, how come you went up there and you did nothing? And when I take about 5 paragraphs to explain it, their eyes will glaze over, and they go, you guys are the same. So you need to know the specifics. You need to understand what's being proposed to cut, what the public impact of those cuts would be. You need to evaluate that in your own mind as a citizen to determine, is this a good or bad thing to do? Is this counterproductive or not? And then what you need to do, and this is the boring part, you need to follow the details of how each of our different components operate in the next few days to determine if in the short term we've done what's necessary. In no question, in the long term, we have a significant gap, but at least when you begin a budget year in 09-10, we haven't asked people to start structuring budgets on the basis of you'll get this or you won't. We can tell an organization in advance, expect this to happen, and now plan accordingly. And those of you who manage those organizations are smart enough to know how, with enough advance notice, to begin the process of making the small level tough decisions that are big tough decisions.
Patterson is in general a was very liberal state senator. So is it that he proposes such drastic cuts because things are that bad? Is it that you do that so then you work backwards negotiating?
Well, how many of you have ever negotiated for a used car, a house,
Yeah.
anything?
Yeah.
Everybody in this room is negotiating. Do you give your best offer the first thing out of the gate? No. And generally, when you present something, you present a worst case scenario that you can work off. So I believe that what we're looking at is a worst case scenario where there's flexibility to negotiate, number one. If you have a dance partner to negotiate with, apropos to what I said. The second thing is, and I know Suzi touched on, and I want to touch on it because in my house in the Assembly, there is a greater willingness to look at raising revenues. What does that mean, raising taxes? What kind of taxes? Income taxes. And in what capacity on those who have the highest level of income? There is a willingness in the Assembly to consider reestablishing the tax rates that existed prior to the Pataki years, or during the Pataki years where they were cut. Reinstitute that for people who are making $1 million or more a year or $5 million more a year. There have been estimates that said that would generate somewhere in the vicinity of $1.5 billion to $2 billion. Now, there's not going to be any revenue generation without cuts. They're going to have to be agreed upon cuts because this does involve having to make quote unquote tough decisions. But tough decisions that are leveraged by everybody in the society making a tough choice. Because the bottom line is when you look at these cuts, the vast majority of them will affect poor people. Because most government programs are designed to help people who don't have resources. If you have the resources, you're probably not using the government resources to help you live a better life. And so I think in my house, and I'm sure there's sentiment in Suzi's house as well, if it's a balanced package of cuts and revenue raises, and keep in mind, I know Suzi has already made this point, if we were to cut the school district, if we were to cut, and thankfully in this budget there's no cut to the municipal government, to the extent that it saves the county government a little less harmless, we would be raising property taxes by extension. So when somebody tells you, well, we're not voting to raise taxes by making cuts, it depends on which cuts. Because if you make certain cuts, you are certainly raising taxes. You're letting somebody else vote to raise the taxes, but you are raising property taxes if you make those other types of cuts. And I think that also has to be brought in, because when we bring up the R word, which means the T word, taxes, you know, that's going to be Paige's lead story. No offense, she's a great writer. But the lead story is going to be, they're not going to raise taxes. And I told you he was going to do that. You know, so that's what you face in looking at, you know.
Question, way down. Yes, Carol.
I heard what you said about the Senate Republicans, and I'm just curious, is there any scenario that you can think of that would encourage them to actually take action before they lose power? Or are we realistically waiting until after January 1st?
That's a very good question. And I can't put myself into the mind of Dean Skelos. As you know, Dean Skelos has only been the majority leader for the last several months, because Joe Bruno has stepped down the last week of session. I don't think so. They have never, in my humble opinion, looked at sometimes the greater good. And the areas that are most in need are normally districts that are heavily Democratic. So that is the political reality. And so when we try and do things, like I'm back in education, but if we try and do things that we think are educationally appropriate in inner city areas, places where the need is great, rural areas, where there are serious educational problems. We don't normally see a lot of support coming from the other side of the aisle. And it was only when the CFE case got resolved 2 years ago, the campaign for fiscal equity got resolved by our highest court, Court of Appeal, that we started to see appropriate funding going into areas that were poor. And at that time, we put in something called the foundation formula, which is to take care of the poorer residents. We are the wealthiest county in the state when you put us into a computer. Now, we do have pockets of severe poverty here, but the county as a whole is the wealthiest county in the state. So with this new formula, which goes inverse to the wealth of the community, taking into account the children that are disabled, the English language learners, they're always separate. But when you put us in a computer, we are the wealthiest. And therefore we expect to have the greatest burden. And that's the reality of life. And I just want to pick up on one thing that George had said. Sometimes the newspapers do, I think, do a disservice to us. I remember months ago during the campaign when I was very strongly opposed to a school property tax cap. We have seen what caps have done in other states, and even if we try to ameliorate the disadvantage of the cap, there really is no way to do it. Because unexpected burdens crop up, and they have to replace, and we don't know what we'll be facing. And the fact is that if the citizens in a community do not like their budget, they will vote it down. And when they vote it down, what are they left with? They're left with a contingency budget. The contingency budget is the 4% to 120%.
Louder.
It's 4% or 120% of the CPI is the cap and is what the contingency budget is. The difference is that if you go in a contingency budget, the residents of that school district are the ones that have chosen to do it, not all the money saying onto the school districts, this is what you must do, and we're not giving you any money to do it. Another unfunded mandate. The unfunded mandate there is a problem because what's been happening for at least 3 decades now is devolution. Devolution is each higher level of government is pressing down the costs of governmental services to the next lower level of government. When you get down to our level, the local level, we only have the property tax. We don't have the variety of taxations that exist at higher levels of government. Getting back to my stuff. So, why I say the press isn't very fair, they keep talking about how special interests grab us. And that it's because the unions don't want to see a school property tax cap. The fact is, there are many entities that don't want to see it. The School Boards Association of New York State does not want to see it. The PTA of New York State does not want to see it. The League of Women Voters of New York State does not want to see it. The school superintendents of New York State do not want to see it. The municipal officials of Westchester do not want to see it. So, you'll hear that we're in the pockets of the special interest. That's how they like to play it in the newspaper. Maybe it sells newspapers and makes it seem like there's intention there. But you folks are pretty aware of what's happening, and I don't think I have to lecture you. But sometimes I look at the newspaper and I just want to tear it up.
Yeah, me too.
Another question.
The state budget's like this thick,
No.
but
We are several budgets. We have 7 budgets. Each one is that.
Has there been a real review of all of those 7 budgets? For all those different agencies, for all those little committees that employ people? Is that going to happen
Let me
as
just-
part of this budget, or part of the budget review, or separate, or government agency?
Let's go over the calendar of what's happening. In January of last year, Governor Spitzer, remember him? He put out.
Yes, wonderful programs. I love them.
In any event, he put out a budget in January, which is the constitutional time frame by which it has to come out. And I think the budget was in round numbers about $124 billion. And as Suzi pointed out, the state budget is not like what you think it is. It's not a single document. It's not just tabular. It's paragraphs with amounts attached to them. And it's broken into a number of different component pieces. There's an education budget, there's a health and mental health budget, there's I forget the comment, transportation, housing, a combo of 3 or 4 things. There's a debt service budget. And you'll hear people say, I voted against the budget, meaning they voted against individual components of it, even though on some of the biggest ones, the vast majority people voted. So when that budget came out in January, the review that you talk about is what happens during the normal budget process. It's the same thing for the town when you get to this time of the year. It's the same thing that happens to the county government. I see Judy in the room, but Judy Miles will tell you they're going through it right now. All of that detailed review, line by line, blah, 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 blah. When the budget was finally adopted on April 8th, 7th, whatever it was, there had been about $2.9 billion cut out of the budget, which was a relatively unique moment. I've only been up there 4 years. It hasn't happened during my tenure, and I'm told in general that the legislature generally adds to the governor's budget, not decreases it. So that was the review, and when it closed at 121 point whatever billion dollars. There was a general sense that we were going to watch what was happening in the economy and make adjustments as the year went along. Because the weekend that we closed on the budget was the weekend that Bear Stearns collapsed. Lehman was tottering at that time, but it didn't collapse at that point. And you really couldn't predict. Nobody could predict what was going to happen within a month, 2 months or so. The governor comes out, I believe, in late July on a radio broadcast and says, we have a growing budget gap. The revenues aren't coming in the way they expect to do. And I want to call you back in August, and I'm going to put before you some changes and cuts, some of which I'm going to do with an executive authority, and the rest we need legislative approval to do it. And we will cut the budget in August and put the budget back in balance. We went up there in August, middle of August. He, I think, had discretion to do about $600 million of cuts. You know, you can imagine administrative discretion. You don't need to go back to the board to get approval to do certain kinds of things. But you come back to the legislature, we agreed upon $427 million worth of cuts, which included cuts to the healthcare industry. Anybody here in the healthcare industry will point to that there was a second round of cuts in August and so forth. At that point, we all sang Kumbaya, the budget is back in balance, and we go forward. And as we go forward, we now start to hear more reports about how the budget is out of whack. And it's out of whack because revenues are dropping. So what's intrinsic in what you say is, did we do a review of the full budget and analyze every component part? The answer is yes, in our once-a-year budget situation. We're just on the cusp of that again for the 2009-10 budget. But because the revenue dropped precipitously, you know, based on the estimates that we make, and keep in mind, I think I said this in one of the prior summits, the state government taxes wealth and transactions. Local governments have a more stable base because they tax fixed wealth and property. And so, you know, unless you have a place like in Buffalo where there's a lot of properties that are being lost to taxes, there's a reasonable expectation at the village level, the town level, the school district level, the county level, that your revenue stream is basically going to come through because your basic revenue stream is property tax. You do have sales tax, you do have mortgage reporting tax, and those are the flexible taxes. At the state level, everything is flexible. You're making estimates on economic transactions to project income, to project sales tax revenue, to project business tax revenue. And all those projections change when the economic market changes. So I know I'm over answering this, but the bottom line being that the full review was done. And then as the revenue drops, the governor comes back to us in August, says, we need some changes, here's some proposed changes we need, we adopt them, we're back in balance. The situation continues to erode, and he comes to us and said, it's continuing erosion, and I have a plan to solidify that. You come to Albany and determine if this is the plan. That's how we get to that.
Is the budget the best way to do the review of what I'm talking about? In other words, we have all these different agents, we don't even know where they are.
Well, I mean,
is there a
no,
push
we know
for
what they are.
consolidate, well, no, well, is that we have two commissions going on consolidation, from the local point of view?
We bring in the people that are responsible for the creation of the budget for their agency. Maybe I can distribute, once we get a schedule, when each of those budget reviews are taking place. There's one for every agency. So we go through it and question the people that have created this budget. This became much more public in the last few years. It used to be done more behind the scenes. Now it's being done with much more transparency. When I get the schedule, I'll share it with all of you, so that the particular piece that is of interest to you, whether it's housing, transportation, whatever it is, you may be interested in coming up. We do it in the hearing rooms, and there are hundreds and hundreds of seats, and they're usually quite filled.
And you referenced like two commissions that were created, the Suzi Commission, I assume, and the Lundin Commission. Both of those were executive branch commissions where the governor said, we're going to impanel a group of people to look at structurally, in one case, school funding, and in the other case, the structure of governments, meaning local governments as well as state governments. And they came back with recommendations. Now, the final report for both committees have not been presented. What you saw in the Suzi Commission, which led to this public debate about the school tax cap, came from a preliminary report in which Suzi himself came out and said, and of all the recommendations we make, this is the one that has to be done right away. That was his subjective decision to highlight that one. Those are independent reports that are given to the governor and the legislature, and then we look at it and write it up the same way that on the village level, you ask for a consultant report to come in, and then once the report comes in, you evaluate and you determine, is this the right strategy or not the right strategy. I think it's going to be very hard if we leave town this week and we don't take any action at all. I think that's going to affect the bond markets and the way they look at the state's willingness to make tough decisions. I draw, John, from experience. Suzi, of course, was mayor of Mamaroneck Village. I was a Rise City councilman, and I served in the county legislature. And in those local governments, we cared a lot about our bond rating. Now, we're fortunate in the county to have a AAA, but that's also created by the fact that the towns and the cities give an automatic warrant at tax time. In the city of Rye, we have the AAA, but Rye City is a community that's structured a certain degree of wealth and without some of the other hills of, say, Port Chester next door. That was a very important element to us. New York's bond rating is pretty low, and obviously, if it were to be downgraded because of the way we handle this crisis, which is different from what I experienced when I was in the county legislature and on the city council, where we used to talk all the time of, if we don't do this, it's going to affect our bond rating.
That's because Westchester has a stellar bond rating. Ain't so for New York State.
I saw the hand over here first. Dana?
I've noticed that in other states in the United States, the credit companies get varying degrees of interest on the credit card. And New York State allows them to have 29% interest. Now, if New York State could have them cut that down, would that help low-income people? Because I think 29% is usury.
It all depends who controls the Senate.
States are only paying 15%, and we're at 29%.
Now, I'm in the process of writing a bill on this. All depends who controls the Senate.
Okay.
All right, question here.
I think when you talk to Paul and any superintendent, I'm sure they already told you in your meeting some of the onerous requirements that they have to carry out with their and the pressure on their funding, but I'm not clear I understand who would be in charge of changing some of these, whether it's our pension commitments or some of these other things. I also would like to know, since you have a lot of groups represented in this room, what citizens can do other than emailing and bothering you to have a voice in this. I think we want to make sure that we are protected, that the true needs of our community, the true diversity of our community is viewed appropriately by people who will be making decisions. So I know it's two different questions, but those are.
I'll start with the last one first. I think this is the kind of start that you need, which is a public discussion about what's happening in the state budget thing that engages people at a level of depth that goes beyond what they may have heard about on the radio or read about, in the daily newspapers. I'm afraid that over a long period of time, this applies to county government as well, most people don't pay much attention to it, and therefore decisions get made. And now that we're at the point where decisions may get made that could be very injurious to the way, people live their lives and quality of lives, engage in these kind of conversations. I would say in terms of the education funding issue, that school tax cap thing that came up, I think there's a role for PTAs and to sponsor conversations, in their home jurisdictions, so that people understand those issues and the issues of school funding, and raises the public awareness of exactly how this thing happens. In terms of lobbying us, obviously Suzi and I are accessible. Her district's twice the size of mine, so it's amazing how she covers the larger turf. But the bottom line is that the expression of feeling in an email or in any other conversation is valuable. I can tell you from my perspective, when I get the emails, I print them out. It seems like a waste of paper. But I'll have a conversation with one of the top staffers, and I'll say, wave the paper out. This is what my district is saying. When we had the financial gap, or the state funding gap for Mamaroneck School District earlier this year, that was, we had a meeting with Lynette and with Paul and so forth. That was a tool that I used on my side of the aisle, because as Suzi said earlier about Westchester in general, it applies to Larchmont Mamaroneck in specific. The perception is everybody here is a millionaire, and unless you can make a case, particularly in the Assembly, where you have representation of all the 4 neighborhoods of the state, unless you can make them understand that Mamaroneck has its needs too, it's very easy to pass by on the highway. So I think this debate at this level, if you have a panel discussion, it gets on LMC-TV, there's more public awareness and notice about these kinds of things. Suzi points out there's public hearings on the budget. They'll be on cable television, on Cablevision, those kind of things, and that's easier for 2 questions, but I think those are things that raise the level of interest, because the decisions you make locally on your bond issue, on your budget issues, are contingent upon what kind of state aid you're going to get. And then if the state aid were to drop precipitously, then that would affect you pretty bad. Let me just answer comment on the other question. The mandates, when we say unfunded mandates, there are a wide variety of things that are lumped in there. There are unfunded mandates that are within our power as a legislature to reverse, suspend, because they're state generated by legislation. There are some mandates that are executive branch and gotten a real clear picture of the top 10, the David Letterman top 10 things that are the most impactful. I think we generally know it, but in terms of, this mandate means this to the town of Mamaroneck. This mandate means this to the village of Larchmont. And out of that, hopefully can come, either funding of someone, right now the money isn't there, but funding of certain things, I would put into that category special education. No one believes we should eliminate special education services. And whether it should be funded at the local level, I think is very problematic, because by circumstance, you get a $200,000 bill because a person happens to live in this particular area, that particular area. There are other mandates, me personally, that I would suspend. I'm not a big fan of mandatory testing. I don't personally, I'm no educator, so if you're an educator and you disagree with me, just write me off as being stupid. But I don't think that you need mandatory testing all the time. I think it's a tool to solve a problem. If you identify the problem, you use the tool to solve it. But we have gotten there through the feds in the state. And those are just 2 examples of different types of mandates.
Suzi, go see Paul Freed.
Yes, I was about to say, what I'm about to experience now is a particular group, I think I have 10 or 12 of my superintendents are meeting with me. I'm going to call first because they can't meet, but because it's French. But otherwise, it's crazy to be doing this. I put them all together. because everybody was calling into my house. Can you repeat the same thing? So I just said, let's all get together. What they're going to be talking about is specifically that. Relieve us of this. Relieve us to do this. Permit us to do regional collective bargaining. Permit us to do consolidation of supplies, you know, there's a variety of things they're going to put on the table. I think on board with most of the things they're going to suggest is the implementation. But the different groups, the environmental groups, the housing groups, they will sit down with us and say, can you help us do this? Maybe it is necessary to have a contractual arrangement with everybody. So,
Good luck and thank you very much.
and thank you all. Sorry to leave.
How do we call those costs? That's 44% of your total local tax, your property tax, is going to the schools for salary and benefits. And yet, and we can look in a bordering state in Pennsylvania where the contract terms are discussed publicly before the contracts are signed, and where the contract terms are out in the open after they're signed and they're publicly available. And here, our school board, as I understand it, is precluded by law from publicly discussing the terms of the contract under negotiation. So how do we control as a community, not the school board, as a community, our biggest single component of our local property tax? I think that's a question that is something that is essentially an unfunded mandate in the sense that it comes from Albany, as I understand it. It's something that could be changed, and I certainly would have liked to have heard from our incoming education chair what could be done to help us control these costs.
You can't divorce politics from government policy. Let's just be honest about it. New York State is unique compared to some of the other states that you can make comparisons in that we have approximately 40% of our population is based in one very large city, which means it is a very powerful entity when it comes to making public policy in the state of New York. Maybe Chicago is an equivalent in terms of Illinois policy, but you know, in New York City, there is no property tax problem. I mean, any of you who moved out of the city, if you ever owned a house in the Bronx or Queens, you know, the taxes you pay and the property tax that pay. To address the general problems with property taxes and getting into component parts of it, such as the school district, or for that matter, in any of the municipals, the benefit retirement package system that you plug into wherever you have a public employee, requires convincing our colleagues in New York City that we need to make any modifications of any sort in order for us to deal with property taxes on a different level. I will tell you the general sense from many, not all, but many of my New York City colleagues are, they look at the suburbs with anger rather than with any compassion. A, we're wealthier than they are. B, we seem to have the, lack the intense problems that they have. Crime, their school issue is not the funding of schools, it's the general quality of schools. And I've had individual colleagues tell me, Richard, you can solve all your problems if you just merged your communities and your districts up there. You know, you've got all these little districts, and because you want to have this little Rye Neck and this little Rye City district, and you don't want to merge them, then you're paying more for your education services. So that's your problem. Don't ask us in New York City to restructure benefit plans and packages, because that's the way you choose to want to lower your property taxes. And then I respond and I say, look, I mean, there are political realities in suburbia. You know, if the village of Larchmont voters want to merge into the town of Mamaroneck, that's for the voters of those two jurisdictions to determine. It may seem like a brilliant move if you live in some other part, but those are local decisions. I live in the city of Rye and twice voted to merge Rye Neck and Rye City when it was put on the ballot. But the majority of my residents in Rye, and I wasn't in the government at the time, chose not to do it. And so that argument back to the city crowd, and they say, well, then why are you asking us? Because as you understand, New York City and the political base of New York City is very much for working union employees. I mean, they believe in having those kind of benefits, and that's who their constituents are. I imaginarily made Dr. Romney, an assemblyman from the Upper East Side, and I imaginarily made somebody else, I forget, from the Bronx, was it Emmy Lou Sleeper?
Emmy Lou.
And when Emmy Lou goes back to her district, her voters are not these voters who are frustrated with property taxes. They are people living in apartments, living on somewhat limited incomes, working in jobs with limited incomes, and they don't want to hear that I'm going to go after their benefits or their proposal or their benefits and pensions because up in Rye, we have a high property tax. So you understand that is a practical reality of trying to get a state legislature to shift gears. And I know I've looked at the comparables. People say compare yourself to Texas. Texas is similar size. It's a totally different political world to operate. So now, do changes have to be made? Yes. Do we need to have a tier 5 retirement plan? Yes. Does it need so that the person who comes in tomorrow has a different set of benefits and they know on day one that they're going to have a different set of benefits and can plan all their life for that? Yes. I would say now the unions don't want that, but that would be a negotiating point. But in these situations, once again, I'm over answering the question. It becomes a matter of negotiation, and I know I guess I gave Lynette enough time to get out of here. But if Lynette was to answer the question, she'd probably say that the school board has been very actively negotiating, trying to not prohibit, but trying to lessen the impact, and that's one of the reasons why they've had the debates with the teachers union. And right now in Rye, the same thing is going on, because the Rye school board is trying to gain some givebacks, and it's the usual negotiating process.
Well, my question is specifically focused on the transparency that is absent right now in the process. That's where I would like to see a change. I think that would enable the community to make a more reasoned assessment of what it is they're paying for and what they want to pay for.
And what you're saying is that, obviously it's limited by state law, but what you're saying is while the negotiations are going on, you as a citizen, a resident of the school district, would like to see what the countervailing proposals are back. That's something to have a dialogue with the school board. I want to see how they think about it, whether they think it's better or worse to have all of those negotiations out. I understand what you're saying, and I want to make sure there isn't a counterpoint of view that has some rationale.
All right, it is 9 o'clock. If you want to continue, those that can stay, and if George can stay.
I got 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes, great. Because this is a rare privilege in this kind of world. I would like to know, how is Governor Patterson in an overall sense viewed as he's trying to deal with what he's trying to do?
The question is, how is Governor Patterson viewed overall? I've known the governor before he was governor. I've had some dealings with him, and on the personality level, he's got a great funny sense of humor, very down to earth guy. He does not have that sort of imperial nature that sometimes you find in elected executives, and that's very a very positive thing. It helps create enough dialogue. I think the key factor that he is dealing with is that he inherited his position. And as you can imagine, you could look through history and you could say, well, there was Chester A. Arthur, who inherited the presidency, and there was Harry Truman. How the personality of the person who goes into the governorship without the benefit of an election and without the benefit of the mandate. And I can say, those of you who've run for office, there's no question in your mind, once the election is over and you look at a set of results, you get a sense that, the people want me to do something here, and it empowers you when you go forward. Absent that, you have the position legitimately. There's no coup d'etat here, but he has to sort of prove himself. And the guys who are long-term state legislators, the ones who were there before Suzi got there, much less me, and the ones who are going to be there long after we're both gone, those guys, they can chew up and spit out governors, as awful as it sounds. Because you can't get into that district in Buffalo or the Bronx to put them out of office. And they have a base of support that allows them to continue in some leadership position. And so from their standpoint, they can look at this governor and any governor with a very jaundiced eye. They look at that list of cuts and say, you know what, I'm not for that. And just history has it. Woodrow Wilson comes back from World War I and the Versailles Conference, and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge says, over my dead body. Who won that battle? Dead history, right? A senator from one state who was adamant that he didn't want to do certain things, and that carried the day over an executive who was publicly thought of as this savior of democracy. Those kind of things happen behind this line of sight as well. So I think he's liked in general terms, but he's going through a testing process, and I think he's showing, dynamic leadership. Even if I don't agree with some of the things he's doing, I can't deny that he's showing the leadership that a governor's supposed to show. But now he, like Spitzer before him, like Pataki before him, Cuomo before him, he's running into the rocks of set individuals and set points of view, and how that gets negotiated out. That's what differentiates why Hoover didn't do it and Roosevelt didn't. Why Buchanan didn't do it and Lincoln did. Because there's some X factor, and that X factor was present in Lincoln and Roosevelt.
George, you told us that this came about because of an erosion in revenues. And Governor Patterson, in his town hall meeting in White Plains, clearly supported his position for just reducing expenses by saying that raising revenues at this time he didn't think would be working, and he differentiated from previous times when we raised taxes when the wind was at our backs. In this economy, we have far fewer people making more than $1 million and $5 million to tax. How do you see taxing people, income taxes, as a way out of this?
Well, I think
and how is that different from raising the property taxes and all the other taxes that are going to come out of the same pockets?
Well, the first thing is that there is a difference between taxes. I don't buy the argument that every pocket is equal. Income tax you pay based on your earning and your ability to pay. If you've had a good year, you would pay more. You have a bad year, you pay less. I have a much greater antipathy to property taxes, which are fixed and don't depend on your ability to pay or not. So, and I don't equate all taxes are equally bad. But to the main point, when you hear people say everything is on the table, then that means everything is on the table. On the table are cuts to the school districts, which may happen, that may increase class size. There are cuts on the table that could gut what the Washingtonville Neighborhood Housing Alliance does. There are cuts on the table that could require people to lose their jobs at Sarah Nursing Home, to have less nurses per patient. And if those things are on the table, then income tax at the upper end, I'm not saying bring it down to people making $250, but at the upper end of the income level are on the table as well. Implicit in what you said is you implied that if you raise taxes on those people, it would be potentially counterproductive because they may move out of the state, which is a possibility.
That's what the government. That's what the governor said.
Well, the governor said that. It hasn't been supported by past experience, but an individual may certainly do it. A number of individuals may do it because when you are wealthy at that level, you have all the options in the world. You can move to Darien, Connecticut like that. I understand that. On the other hand, on the table also is the fact that, I'll give you just an imaginary name, Lucinda Jones is going to lose her job at Sarah Newman Nursing Home. So I would agree with you. I would be hesitant to do anything precipitously, but on the table, in my judgment, has to be all of those options. And if one of those options affects George Soros, and one of those options affects Lucinda Jones, then they're on the table and they're being discussed simultaneously. I didn't say we're going to raise taxes to close the gap. But what I said is the Assembly is prepared to have that discussion. That's exactly what I said. And you can imagine, when we talk about taxes, I am very precise in what I said. The Assembly is prepared to have that discussion. And I think at some point in time, if there's negotiations, you're negotiating with, you pick on them again, the Assemblywoman from the Bronx and the Assembly member from Harlem and the Assemblyman from downtown Buffalo, who won't sign off on a deal if the only people hurt is Lucinda Jones. So there's got to be an understanding that there are suburban, Richard said it a second ago, and I know it's true, that there are people right here in suburbia who had fabulous jobs who don't have them today. And they may have a certain amount of severance, but when the severance is out, it's going to be hard for them to replicate that job someplace else. And the big bonus check they were counting on ain't coming, and that's going to affect how many people go to Zatoon and a host of other.
That's what I mean. If the bonus check isn't there,
Right.
Then how are you going to tax it?
Well, that's what is causing the reduction in estimated revenue is exactly that. It's the analysis that says incomes are down, bonus checks are going to be down in a dramatic fashion, and so that revenue is not going to be there. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still people who are making over $5 million a year, over $1 million a year. And the point of saying it's on the table is to analyze what would that impact be and how much revenue could you generate and how much of that revenue coupled with cuts would close the gap. Because I can tell you, if I walk into that room and I say, let me tell you the sense of Westchester County, we want no tax cuts, none, no tax increases, none. $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, doesn't matter. My district says no increase. And I can assure you that 35 of my colleagues are going to say, well, let me tell you something, brother, we ain't cutting these other things. You put your issues on the table and then we negotiate. What comes out of that negotiation may be a tax increase at some level. Now, if the governor says he ain't signing it, if the Senate majority, current majority, Republicans say they ain't doing it, then it isn't going to happen because you can't make it happen with one member of the dance play. But if you don't put it on the table, you're not going to get the unions to discuss any kind of compromise, and you're not going to get those affected by the social service cuts to come to the table.
I'm concerned about a lot, but when this notion of the perception of Westchester, it's like looking at Manhattan, to use your analogy, through the prism of the Upper East Side. Now, one of the things that David Patterson, to refer back to what Cindy's talking about, the town hall meeting, when he was talking about the way New York State is viewed by Washington, he said that what New York State has paid in taxes, that he said it could be classified as a bailout package. Now, it struck me that a lot of those that argument, and he also said that New York State's not asking for a handout, but a hand back. And my concern is that, and I heard Suzi talk about this too, that Westchester, we're just flooded with money up here. And we're seen through, again, the prism of the Upper East Side. You have all these people here representing needy segments of our communities. And my question is, how do we work to have people focus not on the median income of Westchester County, but our poverty level, our needs?
This is why when I talked about, looking at, and I gave you obviously a table that just sort of summarizes these proposals. I have here, sort of a detailed backup on it. That's why I handed that out, so that you could get from the standpoint of general cuts to a category to looking at specific cuts and how they would affect individual entities. And I mentioned a couple of them. I went back to Washington a couple of times because that's an easily definable thing. The argument you make is not that where the neighborhood preservation organization is located. It fits a need. And in Mamaroneck, Washingtonville housing fits that need. The fact that it happens to be based in Westchester is irrelevant for our advocacy on behalf of that restoration of that cut. The problem that we both described, we also said that we are people who are trying, and we're not talking about these other legislators from Westchester, I throw Nassau in the pot as well, to some extent Rockland County, to some extent Suffolk County. But we try to argue that you can't dump all the cuts onto the suburbs, and that's both cuts and raising of income, because of what you described as, and I'll tell you what, I grew up in Westchester County. I grew up on South 14th Avenue in Mount Vernon, between 2nd Street and 3rd Street. I went to the Mount Vernon Public Schools and graduated in 1970. I lived in a neighborhood where I was the only white. I lived in a neighborhood where there were 2 murders over the course of my time living in my parents' house. I understand that that's Westchester County too. And if we all got in a bus and drove down the street that I grew up on, that ain't Mechanical Hills, but it is Westchester County. I know